Hello and welcome to my mass combat video. It's been a while, I've been talking about it for a while now. This is semi-scripted, this video, so there may be some ums and ahs that aren't cut out. There's the first one. I'm trying to stay as active as possible with my YouTube content, but have been really busy working on my TTRPG content behind the scenes, which has held up my attention for a good month or so now. So still trying to find a good balance between working on my ideas as well as my YouTube videos. My channel's new segment called Monster Monday and the D&D Reddit horror stories, however, have been my motivation to release regular content in between bigger videos. That being said, today's video is on my Homebrew mass combat rule set. They are somewhat simple and vague, left open for expanding whenever the DM deems necessary. The rules came about when I was scouring YouTube for mass combat rules to use in my own campaign. The players would eventually escape an ancient tower they were exploring and would be confronted by an army of orcs facing off against their human and werebear allies. The rules I found very useful were DM Lair's rules and those by the Dungeon Coach, not to mention the Wizard of the Coast's own Unearthed Arcana mass combat rules. Whilst all three were quite useful, I decided to be difficult and create my own. So whilst not groundbreaking and possibly full of discrepancies, here it is. Let me first explain some terminologies. And by that I mean I'm going to go through the 5 pages and read them verbatim, as well as my little additional bits and pieces here and there. A battle zone is the battlefield, e.g. grass plains, forest, castle, cave system, etc. Basically the environment that 2 or more forces are engaged in combat in on a VTT battle map. It can be represented as a simple shape, square, rectangle or circle, or more border defined ones using a polygon tool. While PCs may not initially begin or end their turn in combat when passing through a battle zone, they must roll for initiative with the others of their party. This is to help track time as well as the possibility of drawing attention from nearby enemies. By its nature, being overcrowded with fighting, battle zones are considered difficult terrain. For each round of the initiative order, the DM can reshape the battle zone to reflect the progression of the battle. I'm going to interject here and say, yes, we can do that with my rules, but it could be time consuming since, depending on the VTT, rearranging or reshaping a battle zone using a simple outline or a polygon tool can take some time depending on the system. I'm not familiar with the other VTTs other than Owlbear. I know that's pretty noobish of me to say since I've been playing role-playing games for a long time now, but the polygon tool does have points that you can add to the sides of the shape and you can sort of move them around and reshape it. But I think it can be a bit sort of fiddly, and in the end, really, you don't need to show the players this boundary. You can make it invisible and just so only you can see. But we'll get to the parts that the players can see and know what density of the battle zones are like. This also gives a sense of realism, detailing the movement of the fighting mass. It can also be useful to have a text box assigned to the shape, showing the players a tally of how many allies and enemies there are in the battle zone. Though this is not mandatory, it does come in handy when discussing army combat. There are 3 types of battle zones, the first being contested, a zone that has not fallen to either side of the battle, with an encounter roll of 1d4 if an encounter is successful. 2. Dominated, a zone that is almost in control of one side of the opposing forces, with an encounter roll of 1d6 if a random counter is successful. And 3. Controlled, a zone that is completely controlled by one side of the opposing forces with an encounter roll of 1d8, and the random encounter will always be successful in these zones. Random encounters. Moving through a battle zone, whether contested, dominated, or controlled, will bring the PCs into random encounters. Any players ending their movement in a battle zone, as colorized on the VTT map, must roll a 1d20 to determine if they enter an encounter. For a contested zone, odd numbers 1, 3, 5, etc. rolled is an enemy encounter, and even numbers are no encounters. Same for dominated zone, but the PC rolls at disadvantage. With controlled zones, you do not roll and it is always an automatic encounter, which makes sense because the zone is controlled and there are no enemies except for the foolish players who are meandering through that zone. When PCs leave a battle zone, they are free of the encounter rolls unless they end their turn 10 feet outside the edge of a battle zone. This will require a PC to roll a 1d20 at advantage. When a PC rolls an encounter, the DM must roll the encounter die as per the details above to find the total number of enemies there are. Enemies that are summoned via the encounter roll will have a personal zone radius equal to their movement. Should a PC leave the enemy's personal zone, the player must roll a 1d20 with odd numbers being the monster gives pursuit and even they abandon chase due to an ally intercepting them. A tip for what monsters to use for random encounters. I would suggest immensely weaker ones to give the feeling that the players are carving their way through a horde of enemies. A lot of other YouTubers suggest using a modification of the swarm rules. However, I would recommend using orcs and goblins if your players are level 5 or more, or dropping the AC and HP of other monsters to make them more squishy. Planned encounters. Whilst random encounters are helpful to have the PCs assailed as they pass through the battle zones, having planned encounters on the battle map is essential for dynamic and challenging combat. However, keep in mind that random encounters happening during planned encounters, they will happen each turn, will make fights noticeably harder and affect the balance of the game. Planned encounters are used more specifically when setting objectives for the players to complete, which I'll explain later on. Packed Battle Zone. A packed battle zone is when two or more armies are pressed up against each other and there is almost no room for movement, with the occasional pockets. A good example would be a mosh pit at a metal show. In these situations, the PCs will need to overcome the average strength DC at disadvantage due to the amount of enemies of the army monster type they are trying to push through. If the crowd are allies, the PC gets advantage. Overcoming the DC will allow the PC to move at half movement through the crowd, thereby pushing a monster out of a square or hex on the battle map for the player to stand. If the PC is surrounded by monsters, they instantly trigger opportunity attacks for any that they pass. So a tip for you players, don't try to push your way through a hostile army. Stealthing through the battle zone. Before entering a battle zone, a PC can determine if they can move into it unseen. This requires a stealth check with a DC of 8 plus the enemy's average wisdom bonus plus the battle zone awareness, +2 for contested, +3 for dominated, and +4 for controlled. If the PC succeeds, they can ignore the random encounter rolls and continue as normal. Each turn within the battle zone, the stealth PC will have to roll another stealth check, adding +1 to the DC. This increase happens each turn, until the player leaves the zone or fails the roll. The reasoning for this DC increase is the inevitability of the PC being noticed by the combatants, more specifically the enemy faction. When maintaining stealth in a battle zone, PCs are expected to use the environment to their advantage. For example, in a forest they can hide behind trees. If there is no cover, however, the DM can +2 to the stealth DC. Additionally, PCs can use skills such as performance or deception to appear as friendlies to the enemy and add the relevant skill modifier to their roll against the DC. A failure against the stealth check will require the PC to face an encounter. Player objectives. Like many of the big dungeon tubers such as DM Lair, Esper the Bard, the Dungeon Coach amongst others, have mentioned, running mass combat works well with objective points. That is, a list of things that the players need to accomplish to have their allied army win a battle against an enemy, such as reclaim a checkpoint or defeat a champion. Objectives can be as many as you want, but I'd recommend maybe 3 or 4. In my example, I've used 4. Each time the player succeeds or fails an objective, there will be consequences on how many casualties each army loses. This can be whatever you want, from as little as 5 to 10% to a devastating 30 or 40%. However, try to scale the casualty losses according to the story and how important these objectives would be impacting the armies. I prefer the 10 to 20% for army losses. Originally I began building an actual army combat system, however the weight of it ended up being too much for me to bear as I felt bogged down with the playtesting rules. In the end I decided to go with a more ambiguous system, which allows freedom of narrating the to and froing of armies. If you want to put tallies on the VTT of how many soldiers both sides have, as I mentioned earlier, you can. But this is not necessary. I would suggest that should an army reach 50% or less of its capacity, you should consider a morale check using wisdom, or narrate how you would envision the army's reaction to its losses, i.e. will it fight until the bitter end, or will it break and flee? Now, let's do an unscripted playthrough of the rules. We have a party of 4 adventurers. They will be trying to do 3 objectives in this demo. 1. Reclaim a checkpoint. 2. Defeat a champion. And 3. Secure a strategic location. In this example, I have an army of hobs, which is my term for greenskins and goblinoids, versus a human army. Okay guys, this is going to be a demo. I should have done one earlier to see if this is going to be successful, so I could easily stuff up and make a fool of myself. Okay, this is one of my current campaign battle maps in Owlbear Radio. As you can see, the 3 battle zones are defined by the red, blue and yellow borders, which I made with the polygon tool. Red is the Hob Army, my racial collective for goblinoids or greenskins as they are known in D&D and Warhammer universes. Blue is for the human army, the player character's allies, and yellow is the contested zone or no man's land where both sides haven't captured it yet. I've labelled the zones as contested, dominated and controlled on the map only as a guide for this video. When a PC is in this area, the rules of random encounters apply, with the allocated die, that is 1d4 for contested, 1d6 for dominated, and 1d8 for controlled. These large tokens depicting groups of soldiers are what I call battle mats, which are to set the tone and provoke the player's imagination that there is fighting all around them, instead of importing hundreds of tokens into the battle map, which you can do if you really want to. I've lowered the battle mats below the grid so the players can move their own personal tokens across them. The PCs, which I've dummied up for this video, are a human barbarian, elven ranger, dwarven fighter, and human wizard. I've given them initiatives to indicate their turns. With a battle environment, I want the PCs to always be in initiative order, so they can take their turns throughout the process I call objectives. When in an allied controlled battle zone, you don't need to roll a random encounter, so the players can begin their turn. I would suggest, however, using the battle mats to indicate areas where there is condensed gatherings of soldiers, which will make passing through them difficult terrain. Any spaces around the mats could be imagined as pockets of space where there are few or no combatants or stationary allies. So let's begin. I will first move the barbarian as he is at the top of the initiative list. Because he is starting his turn 10 feet from the contested zone, he will have to roll at advantage to see if he gets a random encounter. On a 1d20, an odd number means it is a random encounter and even means nothing. Ah, damn. 3 and 13, which regardless of the advantage is an encounter. With a contested zone, I'll have to roll a 1d4. Okay, 2 orcs come out of the tree line and enter the dominated area. In this situation, when an enemy enters an ally space, you can enter combat, or use your turn to hail allied soldiers to intercept those random orcs, rolling a 1d8 for the controlled zone. I'm going to use my action to hail allies to intercept these 2, as I want to head towards the first objective, south of here. So let's roll the dice. Okay, that was an awesome roll. I got an 8 on a 1d8. So then we remove the tokens off the map. No need to add them to the initiative list and have them fight each other, as that is just a waste of time unless you want to do that for realism and make the combat painfully slow. Okay, so the barbarian will move now down here to the battle map depicting a clearing, which is the first objective, reclaim a checkpoint. Now let's look at the objective chart. I put this together as an example of the type of objectives you can choose for the players to complete. Objectives are what determines which army wins in the battle. Each time there is a success or failure, both enemy and ally armies will lose soldiers on their side. This is a very loosey-goosey system, so you can choose how many objectives you want the players to try and complete. I would say a fair challenge would be 3 or 4 objectives. In this chart, I've put 5 objectives: reclaim a checkpoint, defeat a champion, secure a strategic location, destroy enemy siege engines, and protect the allied commander. You can come up with your own as well. For this example, I will be using 4 objectives, as they are clearly marked on the battle map. Obviously, you wouldn't be showing these titles whilst in game. Also, winning or failing, each objective will have percentages of how many soldiers both armies lose. I've put 10% losses for succeeding an objective and 20% for losing an objective. You can change these percentages to whatever you want, from as little as 5 to 30 or more. When deducting the army losses, you can have the army tallies on the battle map for the players to see, or you can have the totals hidden and explain narratively the state of the armies. I would also consider a morale wisdom check should the army get reduced to 50% or less of its number, for an element of randomness. Or forget rolling a check and just narrate the losing side disbanding and fleeing should their numbers get dangerously low, or because of the players succeeding or failing. Now let's return to the example. The barbarian has ended his turn in the contested zone, which will also incite another random roll, so let's do that. Okay, another random encounter. So 2 random encounter orcs join the orc captain and his soldiers. Now it's the ranger's turn. Luckily she is not 10 feet near the contested zone, so can move without having to roll. But the ranger will unknowingly move over the controlled battle mat, and the DM reminds the player to halve their speed as this area is packed full of bustling soldiers, so it is slower to move through. She ends her turn near the contested border and rolls for a random encounter at advantage. So no encounter. Now it's the fighter's turn. He is near the border, so has to roll for random encounters at advantage. Okay, so that means an encounter, and gets only 1 orc coming out of the tree line. The fighter decides to fight the orc instead of calling for help and wasting his action. Now we finally come to the wizard's turn, and he does not have to roll a random encounter and can move. The wizard will catch up with the barbarian and end his turn there. Now we must roll for a random encounter because he ended his turn in the contested zone. Okay, so this means no encounter. We would then roll the initiative of the orc champion and his men to add to the battle. I would suggest an initiative for the champion and one for the other orcs as a group initiative. As you can see, the second objective on the map would be to defeat the ogre warlord down near the bridge. If the PCs defeat the ogre, the third objective is securing the bridge, which can be role-played as having human soldiers called over to guard it. The last combat objective is further south, which is protecting the allied commander from this ambush. If this is completed, the PCs will see the success of the human army against the hobs. Okay guys, that's it for me today. I attempted this video like 3 times and finally got there. I will be releasing my gnome video later tonight or tomorrow to make up for the no videos last week. I was busy shooting the last major scenes for my friend's music video, so I was super busy. Enjoy the rest of your week, and until next time, remember this thought.